Now on this channel I mainly focus on giving a review of a game that I've played and have done this formula for over a year now, and will carry it on of course, but having completed multiple franchises, whether that be Resident Evil, Batman Arkham, Far Cry, Tomb Raider, or even Assassin's Creed, I thought because there's a good amount in each one, every now and then I might do a video where I go through each of the titles in the series and order them from worst to best, starting with Assassin's Creed in this video. I think it will be a great idea and a switch up from the norm. Now I've played every Assassin's Creed game with the exception of the first, Assassin's Creed 1, or just Assassin's Creed. Now it may sound odd that the first title is the only one I've skipped, but personally I don't think it's a massive deal. I know a good amount about the game, that being the main storyline, gameplay from videos as well as other people's thoughts on it, and it is the earliest game so realistically there's not a lot to be missed, and you could easily skip over it. I mean it was 17 years ago and the gameplay is quite minimal, and overall the game is just quite short. So I'm sorry for anyone that was hoping to see AC1 on the list. Who knows, maybe I'll actually play it one day, but I just think I've left it a bit too late now, after playing every other game after it. I just thought I'd mention that before anyone starts commenting about it. So let's start off with the last place on the list, Assassin's Creed Rogue. This one is an odd one. I mean I know a lot of people don't even consider it a core game in the franchise, which I can sort of see, but technically it is. It's weird because this game came out in 2014, the same year as Unity and the same day. The main reason for this was because the next gen consoles, PS4 and Xbox One, were launching that month. Now Unity was the main game they were focusing on, and was the first Assassin's Creed for next gen, with a new engine and everything. But obviously not everyone is going to have a new console, therefore, to please everyone, Rogue came out only on PS3 and Xbox 360, and Unity of course came out on PS4 and Xbox One. The only thing is, Unity was the main focus of the year, and it makes sense, and Rogue was seen more as a side project I guess, and I appreciated what they did with a massive flip of the narrative. I mean it had never been done before, that being you now totally playing as a Templar rather than an assassin. And I was already sort of hesitant about the idea, but again they had the flexibility to do anything this time round. It switched up the pattern of what we were used to, and when you do play from their perspective you learn that it isn't totally one-sided, and both sides have their share of evil. And then Shay, the main character, is actually an assassin at the beginning, but then switches over after realising what's better for him. I see it as extra backstory to the games around this one, that being 3, Unity and Black Flag, and just building up this giant feud between them, which although it could be skipped over, especially because the gameplay is very similar to Black Flag. Again, I didn't mind it because not only is Black Flag gameplay fine, but I knew this game wasn't gonna revolutionise anything, and the story is what made it that better. The biggest difference in the combat was probably the fact that you used the sword and dagger rather than just 2 swords, because you're no longer that much of a pirate I guess. I didn't mind learning and playing through this perspective, and I'm sure for the less casual players who want to dive deeper into it and learn more about the Templar side, then they'd love it. Not to say I didn't, but compared to all the other games I could already see this being the lowest unfortunately, and it's still not a bad game. Next up we have Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I loved the idea of this setting. I was so excited to play in this Victorian era London, especially with me being from England. This sounded great, and it's also the most modern setting in an Assassin's Creed game. Before checking it out I thought it would be higher in my list just for this reason. Now with Syndicate they also tried something different like in Rogue. This time you play dual protagonists, something that they've moved into for the upcoming title Shadows, this being siblings Evie and Jacob Fry, and I didn't mind the sound of this, and the characters themselves are quite likeable and the voice acting was quite good. You do see that sibling relationship between them, with humorous lines and scenes in the game. I actually enjoyed the narrative. Now as it's more modern, I suppose they had more experimentation to do with the newer gameplay features, like drivable carriages and carts, as well as the massive addition to parkour with the rope launcher and grappling hook. I'm not gonna lie, it was quite fun to navigate around the city, especially with there being so many tall structures. It made it a lot quicker to traverse through. Part of it does take away from the climbing aspect of parkour, which is a massive thing in the series. I didn't see myself doing as much of this because of it, but again, it was something different, and in my opinion the parkour wasn't a massive issue. It's mainly the mission design, which felt kinda repetitive and similar, like infiltrating an area and taking out one target. Now I know this is in all the games, I know that, but there's also a variety of missions in between them, whereas this one didn't have that many different missions or tasks to do, making it feel quite repetitive. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the combat mechanics and how they felt. felt. It felt clunky and sort of unresponsive at times, and that's not just in the animations. We had a totally different set of melees to use as well, that being canes and knives, rather than the usual sword. This would have been cool if they felt good to use. Instead, the combat also felt quite repetitive. Most of the fights consist of spam attacking or powering, whilst doing hardly any damage to the actual enemy, and you could see that through the health bars, which are also a new change. I didn't mind it, but with this type of combat and how most of the time I was hitting them over and over, seeing that health bar decrease painfully slow made it that much more boring. That's probably the best way to describe the combat of Syndicate. It's just a bit boring, especially coming off from Unity, which allowed more of a challenge and more to do rather than just spam and parry. I did like the approach of Syndicate for sure, it just has too many flaws to put it higher on the list, which is a shame actually, as I did want to, because I love the setting, as I said, and I may be kind of biased. Now next up we have the latest game in the franchise, Assassin's Creed Mirage. The thing is with this game, from the news we heard beforehand and Ubisoft's approach to a more back to roots Assassin's Creed game, that a good amount of fans had asked for a while now, ever since they switched over to a more RPG style game. What they wanted to do was please both sides of the fan base by bringing out one last linear and back to roots style game with Mirage, and then Assassin's Creed Shadows going straight back to the giant RPG style with a highly requested setting of feudal Japan. I did like the idea of them going back to the older gameplay and setting, only if they did it correctly. It did feel like a change in pace to what we had been used to for a while now, so it was fun to go back for sure, but after playing through the entire game, it does have a lot of flaws. There's aspects that they nail and I loved, like the stealth side, which they seem to put a massive emphasis on this time. It felt like the older games and almost every main mission focuses on it, unlike the newer games. And the black box missions made me want to only do stealth every time, not hitting the same if you went all out in combat, just a bunch of methods to silently take down an enemy and plan out a route, great stealth and assassination animations, always integrating the environment when hiding in bushes, ripping open bags of dye or explosives, a bunch of equipment like throwing knives, blow darts, smoke bombs, etc. It was clear in the build up to the game that stealth was a big part of it, but it seems like that's what they thought the earlier games were only about, just the stealth, which is just not true. Though the stealth highlights the assassin part, which is what the games are meant to be like, the combat takes down this title significantly. The older titles had the stealth and combat balanced, with not one side of gameplay being way better than the other, and I loved doing both and switching between the two with such varied mechanics and fun gameplay that wasn't too difficult. So then with Mirage, as soon as you come out of the assassin stealth side, which they wanted to give you that nostalgic feeling from, and then move into open combat, it's not great. In a way it's similar to Syndicate, in the sense that there's just no freedom there. It seems so basic and linear, basically just waiting for a window when the enemy glows gold to parry them, and then there's literally a prompt saying kill. It just seemed quite scripted and extremely repetitive. Now the other enemy type, the bigger one, consists of you not powering but dodging this time when they glow red, for you to pretty much spam heavy or light attack behind them where they aren't armoured. Overall, fighting them never felt that fluid and just awkward because of the such limited way to defeat them. And those are basically the two main enemy types. There's not a massive selection. Of course there's other ones you'll see the odd time, which are more rare, but there's two core ones I would say. So I felt like I was pushed to do the stealth the majority of the time, which I don't always want to do, and it's hard to avoid combat because there's quite a lot of it, so I don't understand why they didn't pay much attention to it. They could have added a variety of combos, assassinations and special attacks. The combat is a massive loss for me, but also the story of Mirage. I actually enjoyed the origin story and the big lead up to Basim becoming an assassin, and then after that it seems to drag out in terms of the story missions, which is funny because the game itself is quite short, but you having to go back and forth to the same place every time, which could involve you being ordered to travel across the whole map, as well as the smaller objectives that have to be completed to build up to the main quest, involving picking up a clue or speaking to someone for a minute and that's it. So the story does seem like a drag a lot of the time after becoming an assassin. However, the actual main mission design where you can take out a target was quite fun, I must say, when you get to it, as I mentioned earlier. Moving on to the number 9 spot, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the first bigger RPG style game on the list, all set in ancient Greece during the Peloponnesian War. Now I must admit, the world is is beautiful. I loved the look of this setting, and it pained me to put it this low, similar to Syndicate, but we're not just basing it on the look of the game, and if we were, this one would definitely be top 3. Of course, with it being a bigger game, allows them to feature a variety of biomes with different landmarks and smaller towns dotted in between. Now the game does feature a bit of mythology, which I know many players didn't like the sound of it when it came out, just because of the historical accuracy to it. The game includes some mythical creatures, and it could stray away from that accurate representation. But for me, I didn't mind it. In this game, rather than having a dual protagonist where you play as both, you can pick between 2 characters, Cassandra and Alexios. I chose Cassandra as I heard she was just a better character in terms of showing her personality more, whereas Alexios is a bit more reserved, if you know what I mean. Also, Cassandra is the canon character out of the 2. Ubisoft yet again tried something new and sort of risky. I'm starting to see a bit of a pattern. I'll explain. So in terms of the story, you don't actually play as an assassin nor a Templar. In fact, they aren't even included in the main game, which of course takes away from the title of the franchise, but I was actually okay with it. I thought it was cool seeing them try something totally new, and I'm not one of the people who wants the old Assassin's games. I honestly don't mind whether it's an RPG or not an RPG, assassins or not assassins. As long as they do it right, I don't care. The whole story I didn't actually mind. They added dialogue choices this time, which helped you as a player shape the story, and I thought it was a good feature that we weren't as used to at the time. It gives a sense of independency of how you want the character to be and play out, also moving away from that linear narrative, leading to effects in the story and relationships. However, the dialogue choices also add to the story missions themselves, which means the story can switch to a new questline until eventually you have multiple branches of story, which seems a bit overwhelming and difficult to focus on what's actually going on. Even then, some, but not all of the extra questlines, seem like filler and just lost my attention at times, but the black box assassination missions once again, which take up a big part of the game, I loved and enjoyed. Most of the time I do, as long as there's a good variety and the environment makes it in the game. If we're looking at the narrative as a whole though, it did drag slightly, but I didn't hate it, and that leads me on to the gameplay, which follows a similar pattern. The RPG style gameplay is at its peak in Odyssey. A lot of grinding that I wasn't a massive fan of, with a huge leveling system over double what Origins was. This included the cosmetics you can unlock and also buy, gear with tons of weapons and armor, but also the skill tree which had a ton of upgrades to gameplay. Origins was a step up because of the new leveling system, and I felt like that was just right, I'm not gonna lie, and stuck to a slightly more linear side, while still going bigger, but Odyssey just went that bit too far for me and felt way too grindy, which just saturates it too much, taken away from the many good areas of the game. Number 8, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Obviously the Viking theme, which also has that open world RPG style to it. Now just like in Syndicate, I could be a bit biased on the setting again because it's set in England for the majority of the game, with Norwegian areas as well, but I do love it. It's one of my favourites, I'm not gonna lie. I wouldn't say the look of the world is boring or basic like many players have said in the past, as there's still a huge amount of detail in the villages and just the warm colours of the grasslands and dense forests, as well as how old and worn down the buildings are and the ruins dotted around the world that you can stumble across as they're so hidden away. And I love the Viking theme anyway, so although I liked what I did explore in the world, there is a big issue of the actual layout and design of the world. If we're looking at it from a traversal and parkour perspective, it's clear that the majority of the map is either hilly, mountainous or flat land, with smaller villages and landmarks spread throughout, compared to Origins and Odyssey, which still follow the open world style, but they have giant cities and tall buildings and dense towns that you can have fun with parkour traversing on. It was a shame that the parkour aspect definitely was taken down in Valhalla, probably the least we've ever seen it. It's incredibly difficult with this world design. Although I love it, I also love parkour, and it's a massive aspect that's crucial for the game's franchise. So it is a shame it's almost entirely stripped away in this one, which does take it down a bit. The same reasoning with the stealth side of gameplay. Yes, there's ways to integrate the environment, but nowhere near enough compared to the more dense towns and cities in previous games. The Viking combat is a huge part of the game, and almost takes over a bit too much. Now that stealth and parkour are very minimal, two massive factors of why Assassin's Creed is good. Luckily, I think the combat was quite fun and enjoyable. It of course focuses more on a weightier and heavier style because it uses more Viking themed weapons like axes and shields, swords and spears, but it's also so brutal and ruthless all the time, which makes it that much more engaging to do. So luckily it doesn't become repetitive, at least for me anyway. You can also choose between a male and female protagonist for the character of Eivor. I've actually actually played it as both, but finished a full playthrough as the female Eivor. The story's pacing is not bad. I would say it takes a bit to open up and has a fairly lengthy prologue, but overall I actually enjoyed the narrative a lot. Though I said it sticks to the Assassins and Templar conflict, it does have a big emphasis on the character of Eivor and their journey. Though Eivor isn't the most charismatic character of all time, his journey and you basically taking over England's regions is great to play through in my opinion. I think it's way too overhated, so maybe this is a controversial spot, I don't know. Next up at number 7 we have Assassin's Creed 3. So this game was an interesting one because you don't start off playing as the main protagonist Connor, instead you play as his father Haytham Kenway, who you see become a Templar, which engaged me in right away and was great to follow through. However, this opening sequence does go on for a long time, which I don't think is needed. It definitely sets the premise of the game's story, but I still would have got that and appreciated it if it was just half the length. But playing as a Templar like in Rogue was very interesting, and then seeing that comparison makes the narrative so interesting to follow. It was cool that they did this, especially because it hadn't been done before and was a very different take on entering the story, but it worked in their favour with them having to introduce this new character who I think isn't anything crazy, and this twist to the story was needed, I think, especially after coming off the Ezio trilogy. If only it didn't take several hours to open up into Connor's Assassins sequence after playing through Haytham and then training as Connor similar to Valhalla. The story is honestly great and so well written, but at parts the pacing is off. In terms of the world, it's not necessarily one of my favourite settings, as the areas outside of the main cities can be slightly dull and could be a bit more polished, but the cities themselves follow a similar layout to the previous games, which I don't think you can go wrong with. There's so much opportunity for parkour and the use of the environment, mixing that with the combat, which uses the more classic style of gameplay as it is an older game, this being the great set of assassinations and their animations. With fluid combat that's fun to do, and you can use dual melees which vary in almost every move you make, so it's not so repetitive. Being able to counter, break defense, dual assassinate, disarm weapons, throw enemies, not even including the tools you can implement as well. Just way more than what Mirage had to offer in its combat, which is such a shame. This is what I meant by it wasn't just the stealth that was great in the earlier games. Now there is naval combat, which I didn't see any problems with, but they definitely expanded on it with the game's sequel, Black Flag. So it's still great to use, but you can spot the areas that they build onto later in the franchise. And let's say you play Black Flag before this, then it doesn't feel the same. But I still found it fine, but just a slightly less polished version, and one of the reasons why it's lower down, as well as the ones I've mentioned. Which brings me on to number 6 in the list, Assassin's Creed Unity. All set in the French Revolution with the protagonist of Arno. I loved Assassin's Creed Unity. When it launched, it had many mixed reviews. A lot of this was just due to how buggy it was, and it had many performance issues. So there's still a huge portion of players who have yet to return back to it after it's been immensely improved. A lot of people have completely disregarded it, which is a shame as it's been almost a decade since its launch. You think they'd improve it in that time, and funny enough they have. It's definitely a lot smoother now. Now Rogue also came out on the same day as I mentioned at the start, and Unity was definitely the bigger focus out of the two, as it was the one that was coming out on the new gen consoles that year, with a brand new engine, meaning incredible graphics. A huge part of why I loved the game was the world design and its beautiful architecture and visuals. It's one of the best, if not the best looking game in the franchise, depending on what you're basing it on. Even though it's been almost a decade, the textures and the lighting make the world look so realistic, and guess what, the parkour is the best it's ever been, so what better combination? Fun and engaging parkour with an incredible looking game. That bumps up the gameplay by a lot. One day I wish they'd go back to those parkour mechanics. They're so fluid and natural, with each animation looking so accurate. This could be the waving of Arno's arms and legs, the different ways he grabs onto ledges and lunges himself. It's so natural and looks amazing. However, you do have to focus because it's not 100% guaranteed he'll land exactly where you want because of the game's system, so it could be seen as a little inconsistent mechanically, but for the most part I had the most fun with this parkour, and even when you mess up it still looks good visually. Now the actual world design itself is top notch. The cities are so dense with lifelike NPCs to blend in with social stealth, and of course very close up buildings perfect for parkour momentum, with something always sticking out to grab onto within a meter of your proximity, and the sound effects are so realistic when you walk or jump onto certain materials like tiles and roofs or wood. Enough about the world and the parkour. The combat is more challenging this time, and with a different feeling to previous entries, focusing on powering and dodging attacks with accurate timing, and a less easier approach this time round. It was quite a big step up, which I was okay with. I just think because they thought about making it more strategic, then it took away from the variety in the combat, with less of a selection of moves where it started to feel a bit repetitive. Not just that, but it can feel a bit slow, nowhere near as fluid, which was a shame. I saw myself using the tools more, where there's definitely a lot: smoke bombs, poison bombs, pistols, stuns, money bags, etc. Then the narrative and its characters, Arno isn't awful, but there definitely could have been a bit more to his personality, whereas the story, it can go off track easily it seems like, which made it that less engaging. It can feel quite convoluted at times with all the subplots and huge amount of characters. The story and mission design is what Unity is lacking in for me. The mission design does consist of some very frustrating missions and some repeated tasks. A lot of them have unrealistic time constraints to them, or they're just very simple and kind of boring. I wish there was more of a mixture and not only stealth. Many of the missions become easily repetitive because they all felt so similar due to almost all of them being stealth it seems like. But that's not to say there aren't fun missions in the game, and I know I didn't die from boredom from the stealth. It's still good and feels very rewarding after completing it. I just wish there was more variety to it, that's all. Now we move on to the top 5 spot. At 5 we have Assassin's Creed Revelations, the final game in the Ezio trilogy, and a perfect way to end the story and tie it up. That's why it's the lowest in the trilogy for me, just because there's more memorable areas in the other titles. I loved the way they closed this one off and I had to put it high. I always say it, but if the Ezio trilogy came out nowadays, it would definitely be one whole game, like a total of 50 hours or something. Then again, if it did launch today, it would come with an oversaturated open world, a bunch of microtransactions and filled with bugs. I'm kidding. In fact, in a way, I feel like it's unfair to put the 3 games in the trilogy in the top 5, as I'm sort of basing it off the previous 2 with this one. In fact, the ending of this game is what makes it so iconic and such a great story, but that's also because of the other 2 games. I feel like there's not an awful lot to say for Revelations. Seeing Ezio as a much older version of himself after following his giant journey from a baby into a master assassin was just bittersweet. I suppose the middle sort of section, right before the late story, it did drag a bit, maybe even though the game is short. Now I know pretty much all about 1, even though I haven't actually played it. That's why I obviously understand this ending, and that's why I feel like it's a bit too late to play 1 now, because I know everything about it and have played every other game. I did love the Constantinople setting, though I definitely preferred Rome, and that looked way more colourful and vibrant to me with better architecture in the buildings from a visual aspect, and parkour as well. I still liked it though, and the mood of the streets with great outfit designs on a large number of NPCs, and attention to detail with the small stores on the side of towns or the coast, like the colourful spices and food, etc. The gameplay itself obviously doesn't have a giant improvement to it, and maybe that's another reason why it's the lowest in the trilogy. There was some additions like the hook blade, which I actually loved using by the way. I thought that was such a small but great improvement. I'm glad they didn't add much else, as it could have been a bit too much and ruined it in a way. The biggest focus was the story and them closing this era for sure, which they nailed. Number 4, we have Assassin's Creed Black Flag. I know a lot of people who would put this game at top 3, if not their number 1 spot. In fact, it even seems like in recent times people enjoy Black Flag even more now, and to be honest, I get it. It's a somewhat newer title compared to the games I've mentioned around this spot, so the world and its graphics are going to be much better. Maybe newer fans or people who just aren't the biggest fan of older graphics in games will appreciate Black Flag a lot more. I understand, looking at the gameplay and the world, it's breathtaking and holds up now for sure. It's the pirate themed game, and that is the first game in the series that seemed to take it in a different direction, which some could say it's not Assassins at face value, but of course if you look into it then it definitely still is Assassins. just with this pirate style that allows for a bunch of new gameplay additions as well as the brand new world. So much opportunity that we had never seen before in the series, still sticking to that similar gameplay style but with a pirate flair to it. Like the naval combat, which has been moved into the newer RPG games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and some could say Black Flag still holds the title for the best. 3 introduced the traversing the sea gameplay, allowing for ship battles. Black Flag was the perfect game to build on top of that, using mortars and cannons with a total overhaul in customization for your ship. The game made it a lot easier to control and navigate naval combat, which is great, but you obviously do a lot of it in this game. Whilst fighting on the seas, you're surrounded by this beautiful tropical world with bright blue water, palm trees and golden beaches. The perfect environment for a pirate themed game. And the combat itself allows you to use many tools and firearms, with the typical melee, which was so fun to do. So the mission designs were quite engaging for the most part with all these new gameplay mechanics, and so many of them felt so awesome to do, like the giant raids and battles between 2 ships, with explosions left, right and centre, but still balancing it with the usual assassin style missions, meaning that they still somehow managed to add a handful of repetitive ones, like the tailored missions, which were just not needed or definitely not that much. But I've come to accept that with every game at this point. The story of Black Flag is great, and I loved the protagonist of Edward Kenway, who is the father of Haytham Kenway. I also played this game before 3, which is actually the chronological order, so I'm glad I did that. I think Edward is such a likeable character and funny. It felt like such a switch up from Ezio, Altair or even Connor for that matter. Although he isn't my all-time favourite, he seems more joyful and comedic compared to the others, and just shows that he has that true pirate side of him. And seeing his character development is so satisfying to watch and play through, and when I finished the game, I felt I had experienced this amazing journey. Overall, there's not many bad things to say about Black Flag, apart from the small aspects I've mentioned that take it down slightly. Now we have the top 3. Coming in at 3, we have Assassin's Creed Origins. I feel like it's gotten to the point in the list where there isn't going to be many bad things to say about these titles. It was quite difficult to pick between them all. First off, the story was so immersive. I was gripped throughout it all, I swear. Fun fact, I actually finished it in like 2 or 3 days, I think. It was just so addictive. And though I prefer the next story in the list, I adore this one and honestly don't have many complaints, if any. First off, now this game revolutionised the franchise with it being the first open world RPG style game in the series, and it is the best RPG one, which carried on through Odyssey and Valhalla and soon to be Shadows. Like I said, I don't mind them expanding into a bigger game, as long as it's done correctly, which Origins does. Almost perfectly, actually. The world is big, but not too big, so there's not a lot of empty space. And if there is, then it's mostly desert, which I was fine with because you can't do much about that, and it also looks incredible. The gameplay wasn't overwhelming, and the skill tree allowed for a good amount of useful skills and abilities, however wasn't giant and hard to navigate. I also feel like the leveling system was much easier and less of a grind in this game, in terms of how quick you level up with what's offered to you, but also the level cap only being 44 or something, unlike Odyssey. You can also boost your levels if you wanted to, basically removing the system for a more casual experience. I like the idea of crafting gear and weapons, but it's still limited and not much of a grind. There's multiple giant cities spread throughout the map, as well as huge landmarks like the pyramids of Giza. The main and even the side objectives are so engaging and meaningful in terms of adding to that engaging narrative, but also the character of Bayek, who you play as throughout the whole game. He's also up there as one of my favourite protagonists in the franchise, probably top 3. Such a great performance, and the way they portrayed his relationships with other characters in the story, I really appreciated it and made that much more immersive. In fact, the story itself definitely goes quite deep and dark at times, which I wasn't expecting, and it really creates such great atmosphere a lot of the time. I wouldn't say I was that bored by any of the missions at any point, and as I mentioned, it was very addicting, so that says a lot. I also played this in the last year, and it's been a long time since I've genuinely not stopped wanting to play a game. I love Origins. At top 2, we have Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Now, in a way, it's sort of difficult to talk about the game without talking about the one before, but it's basically just extra of Assassin's Creed 2, and by process of elimination, you can tell what's after this. But Brotherhood uses the same characters of 2, who are so good, and of course Ezio Auditore, the best protagonist in the series. In 2, we see him go from a baby into an assassin, and now Brotherhood Brotherhood gives us an entire game of him as a full assassin and creating this brotherhood, and we already know what he's like as a character. They're now just building on top of 2 just a great sequel. But one of the main reasons is the main Templar villain of the game who replaces Rodrigo Borgia. This time we have his son Cesare Borgia. I would say we don't see as much character development in Cesare as Rodrigo. He still makes for a great antagonist, and overall the whole Ezio trilogy with the feud between the assassins and the Templars, whilst you play as this incredible character who you watch grow. It is in a way a simple plot, but it's so effective, not a bunch of subplots and unnecessary filler, just a perfect story which could easily take these 2 games to the top just with that. But we haven't even spoken about the gameplay. The combat, which is pretty much smoother and more fluid, so it's not as clunky, with a few new additions like chain and guild assassinations, and I'd say this makes it easier to fight in a way, but also very fun. It's an amazing sequel that gives you more content of AC2, and although it has less layers in the main story compared to that game, if it ain't broke, don't fix it by adding too much. We also see more of Desmond's character in this one that add such a cool dynamic and much more context. Just seeing this play out was incredible. I wish they did this more in the more recent games. Even these modern day mission designs where you explore these puzzles don't feel lengthy or dragged out. Even the opening mission is great in the game and sets the foundation. I also adore the setting of Rome, with a classic Assassin's Creed world design of narrow alleyways and closely laid out buildings, a perfect playground for parkour and sneaking around. Even though the graphics may not be amazing, they still made this world seem so vibrant and colourful with attention to detail, as it's set in Rome for the majority, whereas they had to work across many cities in AC2. Brotherhood still features landmarks like the Colosseum, which is so detailed, and honestly Rome is one of my favourite settings. So as you can tell, the game itself doesn't add an awful lot, it near enough stays the same, but what is added on to this great story is the main focus by far. However, AC2 by itself, because that narrative is so good, it can't be overtaken even if the gameplay is probably that bit better in Brotherhood. So AC2 is the #1 spot for me for the best Assassin's Creed game in my opinion. I feel like I've already spoken about it in Brotherhood, but for me this is clearly the best game in the series, and as I mentioned, a huge reasoning is the story, which is by far the greatest one in the franchise, and that's without Brotherhood and Revelations, which makes it that much better. I was tempted to put all 3 in #1, but I don't think that's quite fair, as they are different games. There's not a negative thing to say about the narrative. I've said it already, but the character development of Ezio and seeing his journey from the beginning to the end, watching him grow through so many events and grow from them, was beautiful to play through, and makes this game as good as it is. He could easily be classed as the best protagonist and best story ever by many people. The cast is just top class. Ezio, Rodrigo, Leonardo, Mario and Desmond and Lucy, and my man Sean, none of them are forgettable, and that's what's so great about it. There's so many memorable scenes in the game that have stuck with me. It's not just the game is the best, but everything about it makes it so special to me, and that's also from someone who played all these games for the first time within the last year or so.